It's official. You've officially started. All right, so I shared in the chat window with you all the slides from today's. I'm curious for folks who just joined on, do you see the link for the slides from my earlier chat or not?
No, no.
Okay. So it only happens after you get there, so I'll reshare it here. So the videos from yesterday, as well as the slides for today, are on that same page. Feel free to go there, download them on SlideShare. They're there for SlideShare as well. So agenda today, I'm going to walk you through how startups make money, the 14 revenue models. I'm going to have you pick your primary and secondary revenue models. So the why primary and secondary is combination models are incredibly effective, and I'll walk you through why they're effective and show you the data on the original data set as well. But the idea there is you can pivot between a revenue model relatively easy, and I want you to know what your two top choices are. And I'll also share some of the more recent data we're pulling around the market comparables. So not to get you to change your revenue model necessarily, unless you can. Like if you can change the revenue model, I'll give you the data for why you should think about it. But you can't force your customers to buy in a way that's not natural for them to buy. So for example, if you're doing a transaction fee business, it's hard to do subscription or metered service. So I'll walk you through the 14 revenue models. I'll walk you through a light pricing workshop and talk about metrics that matter. In particular, getting to think about how you're going to do the pricing of your product now, 6 months from now and a year from now, and kind of putting in the infrastructure around balancing out the art and the science of pricing. The next one is your go-to-market strategy. So today you're going to build a draft go-to-market strategy that as the team asks you about how you're going to go sell this thing, I'll walk you through here are the mechanics for how you sell, here are the mechanics for how you market. And there's a few choices. I'm kind of a frameworks guy. You probably gathered from yesterday. It's like there's ways to think about how to do this. And a lot of the stuff you're doing isn't new, right? So there are best practices for it. So especially if you've never done it before, the idea here is that these are just best practices you can copy rather than something you're going to invent from scratch. So we'll talk about traction and product market fit. By the way, both of those are math. So they're not, it frustrates me. I was on stage at an event. We actually did an in-person event last week. And one of the VCs that was on the panel I was moderating, when we were talking about, well, product market fit and what do you look for in companies? And she's like, there's soft signals. I'm like, that's actually not true. They're actually hard signals. And as somebody who's a good friend of mine, so I didn't intentionally cuff her on the in the panel, but I don't want the founders to know, like, it's something mysterious or opaque or secret, right? So I probably undersell my book title because I'm not clickbaity enough, right? So there's nothing secret about product market fit. Product market fit is math. So, and I'm going to walk you through what that math is today. And then we'll go into your pitch reviews. So with some breaks along the way. So that's what we're going to cover today. It's very hands-on from a standpoint of, it should give you the framework to understand these are things I need to go do from a marketing perspective, as well as from a revenue model perspective. So that's today's topics. So for everybody who just joined, you can use the link from yesterday. I'll drop it in one more time. So all the videos from yesterday, slides from yesterday, slides for today are in on the website for DK Parker, and then feel free to download them on SlideShare. All right. So how do startups make money? So this started off as a project of somebody asked me for my financial model. I was working for Startup Weekend. They came to me and said, hey, can I have your financial model template? And by the way, I'll give you all the templates today too. There's 4 templates that are the outcome of this exercise that kind of cover 80% of the revenue models. So at least you don't have to start your revenue model, financial model from scratch. If you have a financial model that works for you, great. Don't use mine, right? It's more just a question of, like, rather than starting from scratch, it's kind of crazy. So you can use one of these templates and just make it easier for you to do it yourself. So a startup came to me and said, hey, can I have your financial model? I'm like, well, yours is a marketplace for consumers. Mine's a B2B subscription model. Those share commonalities, but they're very different, right? And so I was like, I can give you the model, but then you'll break it and you'll want me to fix it. So I'll give it to you, but I'd really rather figure out how can I give you a template that you can use for your own revenue model so that we can understand how the company's going to make money. So it raised this question at the time. I'm like, well, how many templates are there? Like, if I wanted to cover 80% of the market, how many revenue models are there? And it started this interesting quest, which was never intended to be a quest. So I reached out to Crunchbase, and the CEO at the time was a friend of mine through Startup Weekend. And I asked him, hey, can you just run a data set? This was before they had their API. Can you just run a list for me of every seed-funded startup company worldwide in the last 18 months? So it ends up that there's 2,654 companies, and we track them over a 5+ year span. So it became a longitudinal study, which was never the intent, right? I was just like, there must be like a count of the number of revenue models that work. So I hired an offshore team. One of my sons, who's now 26, was the project manager on it. And we basically went out and looked at all 2,600 websites and categorized their revenue model into just an open number of a list. Every time that the team found something that was an other, I would reach out to the CEO of the company and ask him, hey, how do you guys monetize? What's your strategy? How do you make money? So every time there was an other, they'd send them to me. So basically over time, we started tracking what the revenue models were, but we also looked at the successes and the failures of those companies, and tracked them into what became 14 distinct models. By the way, if there's a 15th, I'm all for it, right? I'm not trying to break it into a particular number. And then we refined it over time as we looked at the changes in the market. And I'll walk you through what some of those changes were as well. But a revenue model basically helps you understand what's your cost to build the product, what's your cost to sell the product, what's your pricing, and ultimately what's your profit. So I'm going to walk you through those pieces today, so you can basically pick and choose what the pieces are. So a couple notes here first, which is how not to make money. So small transactions are bad, right? So even if you have to do a high volume of small transactions, it's super risky because your pricing can be off. And if you're doing a small number of transactions, it's really difficult. Small percentages are bad unless you have massive dollar volumes. So any business that's in what's called basis points or BIPs, it has to be on a huge transaction number. So if you're 50 BIPs, which is basically 1/2 of 1%, then it has to be on something that's $20,000, $50,000, $1 million, right? So if you're in the bond business, right, it's the equivalent of being the glue between the wall and the wallpaper. So if your margins are low, just know that that's a huge challenge. You can overcome it as long as your transaction value is super high. But small margins and small transaction values combination are really bad. If you can create value but not capture, which means you've created a product but no one's willing to pay for it, that's a problem, right? So then lumpy sales cycles are rough. So if you sell to school districts as an example, right? School districts, you can sell to them in basically a 2-month window every year, and then they're in the deployment mode. So it's really a tough sales cycle because it's tough to keep salespeople happy when they can't make their quota 10 months out of the year, right? So just know that lumpy sales cycle, selling to governments, long sales cycles, those are bad as well. So you're looking for predictability and forecastability in the revenue, and the closer you move to forecasting ability, the more predictable and the growth of the company is, and the more investors will like it, right? So early on, you're back of the napkin. You're like, I have a hypothesis. I don't have any revenue, right? But as the company matures, you should be able to start to forecast the revenue with a level of accuracy. And as you can do that, and some of you are already doing that, so this is no new news for you. But as you're doing that, your ability to do forecast to actual starts moving you in the range of where there's more investors who will be interested in your product or service. So just know that that's part of the process. And then pricing too low ultimately can kill you, right? So one of the things we'll talk about in the pricing seminar piece is I would rather you start your pricing too high and give a discount for the first year or a discount for early customers, but set the expectation your pricing's up here, right? Rather than setting the expectation your pricing will be low. So just know that that's part of the process of how you manage pricing, and we'll talk about the art and science of doing that. Okay, from a revenue model perspective, so business models is kind of an abstract framework we talked about in the Ben yesterday. I'm going to create value, that's my product or service. I'm going to deliver value, which is my revenue model, revenue model, pricing, sales, and marketing. And I'm going to capture value at the end, which is what the margin is that's left over. So some quick overview on the data set. So the 2,654 companies we tracked, these were all companies who had raised at least a seed round of funding. Of the ones who failed, we went back and looked at the Wayback Machine for their last cached page. And consistency there was 85% of those companies didn't have a call to action. They didn't have a price on the site, or the price on the site was call us for more information. So one of the consistent trends here in observing the data of companies who failed was, give an example, say Holland's my boss, and he sends me on a task to go find 3 vendors to do a particular problem. I find 2 of them, they have pricing, and the third one says call us for price. What happens? I don't call you, right? Because your offer isn't generally compelling enough that I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get a hold of these guys so I can bring Hullid a price point. So what I'm going to do is present them with the prices that are actually there, which presents a unique challenge, right? Because in the early days, your product pricing is probably going to be wrong. Actually, I'll give you a teaser. It is wrong. And you're going to change it as you go, right? But you have to make it easy and compelling for the customer to actually want to transact with you. So the important piece there is that, is there enough information on the page for the customer to take action? And if the answer is no, that's a problem. So 85% of the companies who failed didn't have a way, there was no clear call to action, there was no pricing on the page, or their value proposition was kind of muddy. So there was no clear understanding of what they actually do. So consistently, that was part of what we looked at that said, these companies, part of the reason they didn't make it. Now, we didn't look at all of the pages to know that all of them were that way, but in general, of the ones who failed, that was a consistent theme. So I would rather have you put information up there and then ratchet and change pricing over time than not put any information and think that that's going to help you be successful. A couple of the other outlier topics that we learned. One was that combination revenue models were actually super effective. So we, much to my surprise, because in the venture community, the VCs are like, you should pick a revenue model and stick with it, which is awesome, but not actually true. Now, I'm going to tell you to not argue with a VC, because I've finally published the data in the book, but not all the VCs have obviously read it. So don't argue with them over that. Doesn't help you get funded. But just know that like a subscription business that includes services is a great proof point in that it helps you get revenue earlier. Or in the case of Smartsheet, who I mentioned yesterday, if their professional services team is doing work for you, then it shortens the sales cycle significantly, right? Also, in like marketplace companies, we see a trend in the marketplace companies moving from just a transaction fee to a transaction fee plus a subscription for posting companies. So if I'm there to post a job, I'll charge a subscription fee for that, plus a transaction fee on the successful transaction. A couple other things that we observed over time from the start of the project to the end. Do you guys remember Groupon? Do you remember all the copycats of Groupon? Okay, so here's the deal with revenue models. Revenue models are not defensible. So anybody can copy a revenue model. So what we saw with Groupon is Groupon ultimately became lead generation and commerce. Those are the 2 revenue models. But the packaging of those 2 revenue models at the time was super distinct. but it was a company that was required to do global expansion kind of city by city or region by region. So what happened is that every region that didn't have a Groupon started their own, just like Groupon, only better, because there was nothing proprietary about the revenue model. So that was one of the revenue models that we saw at the beginning of the cycle that kind of came up and then crashed, and it ultimately crashed in kind of a huge way. So I'll take you back to the data on that one a little bit later. The other thing we saw was coins and tokens popped up as a revenue model, but ultimately it wasn't really a revenue model. It was a financing model. And the SEC, of course, in the US said it wasn't legal either. But that was one of the only new ones. The only new revenue model that popped up over that 6+ year span was metered services. So think Twilio or Splunk. So in Twilio, I buy a phone number, and as my usage of text messages go up, I charge more for it. So I think AWS and Azure. So for B2B perspective, as my usage goes up, I pay more, right? So that was the one revenue model that was that actually came, that was new during the season. So we keep watching these to see new ones. Like there's a new one right now in Bitcoin mining, but there's only very few examples of that. And then the other one that was in significant decline was licensing. So my original software company was called License Online. We did software licensing and electronic license delivery. At the time, all of Microsoft's revenue was licensing revenue, so perpetual licenses. That revenue model has had significant decline, has been replaced by subscription. And in fact, if you remember 15 years ago, Microsoft was wringing their hands like, we don't know if we can change from licensing to subscription. And now today, everybody's subscription everywhere, right? I can buy LaCroix water on subscription through Amazon and have it delivered automatically to my house. So there's, subscriptions everywhere. So yeah, those are some of the significant things that we saw in the revenue models and changes over time. I would say if you see a new one that's not in the models, I think your interesting comment around subscription being disintermediated on pay-per-use and usage is definitely moving towards, I'll give you my opinions on metered service as well. And so the project we're working on now, I'll share with you in a little bit at the end, is how to value companies based on their revenue model. So we have a list of about 300 publicly traded comps and which revenue models they use and what the company's valued at. So I'll give you some data points on, again, my objective here is not to say, oh, there's a good revenue model and there's bad revenue models. That's not the point. The point is they have different enterprise values as a startup. And if you can optimize around the enterprise value, when you go to sell the company, you'll get a better price point to sell. So just know that that's kind of the outcome of it. Okay, long setup let me walk you through the 14 models. I will give you a list of all 14 at the end, so you can pick your primary and secondary. So don't worry if as we're going through the models, I'll blow through some of the ones at the end because they tend to be a little more obscure. But know that I'll have a list for you at the end. You can just pick your top ones from, okay? All right, first one is fee for service. So think consulting companies. So could be it's where people are involved in the delivery of your service. So that one is definitely the idea of, Deloitte and Touche is an accounting firm, right? Big consulting companies, Gartner as a services company. So those companies can be huge companies. In fact, I'm working on a pricing project for a $1 billion services company today that trades at basically $1 billion in market cap. So services businesses are super easy to bootstrap because your economic multiples are is my project revenue, my hours billed, and my cost for delivering. So I have fundamentally the services business bill rates and pay rates. If I charge the customer $100 an hour, and I pay the consultant $50 an hour, I have 50% gross margin. So services, however, are hard to scale. So because you always have more people involved, or you have to hire more people in order to sell more services and more consulting. On the small business side, the challenge is that if I sell one more customer, it just means that the three of us are super busy in delivery, but I need 3 more customers to hire another person to really scale the business up. So that's kind of the small business dilemma. If I'm on the high end of services, I have to manage to bench time, which is really to making sure my employees are billable more than 80% of the time. So kind of a key metric for services. So you can also include markup on products if you're a reseller. The simplest version on a local business would be a restaurant, which is I have both services and markup on product, and that gives me a combination of top line sales. So if you have services as part of your initial revenue model, just know that that's fine because you're getting early validation. Ultimately, if 25% of your revenue is services revenue and 75% is subscription revenue, the company will be valued on a multiple of the subscription revenue. And the public market doesn't care if you have services revenue, they're fine with it. But just know that you don't want 100% of your revenue. You need to be able to be very distinct about services revenue versus product revenue and subscription. So that's the easiest one, is just services. Okay. By the way, feel free to ask questions as we go here, because I geek out about this stuff, so I'm happy to answer questions as we go. So commerce is the next one, works both B2B and B2C, obviously. So your key metrics are wholesale cost of goods sold. It can be your own product, it can be your reseller product. That part doesn't matter, but it gives you your effective rates is what's my wholesale cost of goods sold, what is my own product or somebody else's, what's my average margin percentage, and what's my average basket. So, and how many transactions do I do a month? So those are your key metrics for commerce. So if I'm making 35% gross margin selling somebody else's product, or I'm making 80% gross margin selling a virtual or physical product, then I know what my margins are. My average basket's $100. The number of transactions a month are 3,000. I can do the math and tell you what my conversion metrics are going to be. So we'll get into the marketing metrics here in a little bit, but this is just the revenue model metrics. So physical goods, virtual goods, all good. And ultimately, this one can mature into a marketplace. If you look at Amazon, Amazon matured into a marketplace as well. The gross merchandise value. So yep, this one spot on. This is your gross merchandise value as well. When you can look at the, we did $100,000 in gross merchandise value. What's my average gross margin percentage, which gets me to my realized revenue, right? Versus, you know, my first business we had. We went from 0 revenue to 32 million in revenue in 4 years. So, but what really mattered was our gross margin, right? So because the other one was kind of a vanity metrics. Commerce isn't marketplace. We'll get to marketplace in the next one, or here in a coming up. So commerce is just straight markup on cost of goods sold. It's a transaction fee. It happens once, and the question then will be things like frequency and recency. How often can I get my customer to come back and buy from me again? So know that that's part of the long term as I look at the marketing metrics. So that's commerce. All right, subscription is next. We talked a little bit about subscriptions. Subscriptions are predominantly the most successful revenue models as it relates to software today. Hey Ryan, how are you? So your key metrics here, or it works both B2B and B2C. So I can do Spotify as an example. If I'm focused on consumers, I can do Salesforce as an example, or HubSpot on a B2B side. My key metrics are average revenue per user, my conversion metrics, which have to do with how many people downloaded it, how many people trialed it, what were my trial conversions to paid, what's my lifetime value, which is basically net of my churn number. So is my churn number 2% a month or 20% a month? Now, early on with an MVP, your churn numbers are going to be super high. So just know that that's, it's kind of to be expected in the early days that your churn will be higher, but you want to see that churn number come down over time. Challenges here are MVPs sometimes aren't enough, right? So especially on the B2B side. So looking for how you build a more robust product so you can have the ability to both increase the price and lifetime value, but also the ability to use that to decrease the churn. So subscription models are great. Everybody's very familiar with them at this point. And there's lots of good data for SaaS conversion metrics and some sources out there that'll help you with that one as well. So this is one of the highest multiples of revenue, not the highest anymore, but it's one of the highest multiples. Okay. So part of this is you get into your average revenue per user and your MRR and ARR. So monthly recurring revenue, annual recurring revenue, and annual contract value, or ACV. So if you can forecast out that revenue and my number of subscribers are growing on a monthly basis, I tend to break that down into what's my monthly recurring revenue or my MRR run rate. So for example, am I going to finish this year at $1 million in MRR run rate, right? So know that those are kind of your key metrics and multiples. If you're doing a transaction fee business, you don't have monthly recurring revenue. You have a transaction fee, right? So there, even though people are like, our MRR is this, I'm like, you have recurring revenue? And they're like, we have transaction revenue, but our monthly, and I'm like, those are two different things, right? So just know that there's a difference there. Let me get to some of these questions here. So commerce and non-market, got that one. Do you do multiple on gross merchandise value or the revenue? Actual revenue is what matters. So we'll talk about transaction fee as one of the options here in a bit too, depending on what revenue model you have according to GAAP. So the GAAP financial terms will say, can I book gross merchandise value or can I book my revenue? Ultimately, your revenue pays for your cost. Your gross merchandise value doesn't really cover much, right? So if you have high gross merchandise value but low margins, your margins are going to be what really matters. And then average revenue per user for B2B is per account or per user? Great question. It kind of depends on your selling model. So my ARPU, if I'm Salesforce, is an account level, though they'll tend to track it on a per user basis, even though that's not the way they bill it. So if you hit Salesforce, you'll see that Salesforce says $28 per user per month. Now you can't buy it that way, right? You have to buy an annual commitment and they're going to charge it an annual contract value for a company. But they're gonna put out a number from a marketing perspective that gives you your lowest possible price to purchase. So just know that that's part of the difference between marketing and your key metrics are slightly different in that one. So subscriptions here, MRR, ARR, ACV are typically the numbers you're going to see for revenue models. Questions about subscription before we move on? Since many of you will be using this one. We'll come back, Rahul, to your question there. Do you have a reference for large ticket size subscriptions? We'll talk about that on the transaction.
Just a question, since the average revenue per user, how does that classify in terms of B2B? So that would still be categorized as one user because it may be one entity actually using that subscription?
So it depends on how you want to break it down, right? But we typically will look at both ACV, annual contract value. So if I'm selling to a business who has multiple users, I'm going to look at it as what my ACV is. And is my ACV going up or is my annual contract value going down? So if for example, I'm launching a minimum viable product and I have an ACV of $1,000, but that $1,000 is going up to $2,000 in year 2, I have what's called net negative churn. Right, so my existing annual contract value is actually increasing by 100% a year. So that's a great indicator of you're growing the right feature set that that your customers actually want. Now, the number of users is still something you want to track because we'll get to it when we talk about the pricing, about how we tier your pricing relative to how it's easy for your customer to say yes to your product offering. Right, so we may say, hey, we're going to price it based on total number of users or seats, or we're going to do it on a contract value, but we want to track the difference between what's our tiering and how do we tier the pricing differences. So a lot of that nuance comes down to the pricing component as well. But by breaking these into separate items, revenue model is different than pricing, then it's easy to look at pricing as just one of your inputs versus a lot of first-time founders will mudge all these pieces together and they get super muddy, right? Because it's like, well, which lever am I pulling? It's like, well, revenue model is revenue model, pricing is pricing, marketing and sales are marketing and sales. They all have different costs associated with them. Make sense?
Okay. Yep.
So in our case, the unit economics are tethered to a vehicle rider driver. So I think it depends on, we'll break them all down. Metered service is the next one. So metered service, think AWS, Splunk, and Twilio. This one, honestly, other than the old cell phone model, it's always B2B. So in the old cell phone model, you got charged per text message. right? Remember those days? It was an incredibly negative customer experience. So you still maybe get charged more if you use more minutes. In the B2B side, if I use more minutes on Twilio, I'm actually kind of excited about it, right? Or if my AWS services go up, it means the customer is using more of my services. So the good news there is that on a B2B standpoint, it's usually a positive association. So from that perspective, metered services are almost exclusively B2B these days. But your key metrics there are your average revenue per user, conversion ratios, just like subscription churn. But then we're looking at what the annual usage value is. The annual usage going up or is the annual usage going down? So that's one of your key metrics there. This one definitely has highest multiple of revenue up even above subscription. And like I said, I'll walk you through what the economics there are too. So that's metered service. This is definitely the trend. If you can bill for it and you can track it, the trend is to go to a smaller base of subscription with a larger metered service, but you have to provide visibility for the client, right? The client, again, like the cell phone example, doesn't want to be surprised by their bill, but they want to be able to track it. So you have to be able to bill for it, provide visibility to it, and make sure the customer understands it. If it's too complex, it doesn't sell. Okay, next one is transaction fee. Transaction fee and marketplace are very similar, but marketplace, you have a buyer and a seller, and we'll talk about marketplaces here in a minute. But a transaction fee business is something like Chugg is a rental company, so they rent academic books for colleges, right? So I'm not selling the book, I'm just making a rental fee on the book. If I'm in the brokerage business and selling bonds, right, or surety bonds, it may be $1 million bond, but the value of the bond doesn't matter. What matters is my margin that I make on it. So the difference between a transaction fee business and commerce is I'm not booking the top line revenue. I'm only booking my effective margin, right? So there's one of the templates that's here for you is the transaction fee model, where you can put in the gross value, right? But you really only care about the margin, right? So you do $1 billion in sales, and the answer is, yeah, but you're at 22 bips, right? So the answer is, who cares about the vanity metrics? I care about does it make money, right? So know that that's the transaction fee business. So I've also listed 99 Designs and Kickstarter. Kickstarter is a great example of, these are kind of on the marketplace side, but in the case of Kickstarter, so they're not actually selling the product, right? They're just taking a transaction fee on that actual transaction, okay? So this one works both B2B and B2C. Your key metrics are your average transaction revenue, the fee versus the margin on the transaction, because you're getting either a fixed fee or a basis points fee, the number of transactions you do per month. So that's the transaction fee business. If you remember Elance and Odesk, they merged to form Upwork a few years ago. The CEO who took that over had to tell everybody he had to increase his margins to get it back to 15% margins. They were down in the 12 and 11% area, and basically the company was going to fail. So just the lesson here is that don't start your pricing too low, right? And a lot of, especially in the marketplaces examples, people are like, well, we're going to start lower and then move it up. You never move it up, right? So you need to start higher and discount for first year or discount for early customers, but don't start lower, because that's the idea that we'll move it up later is an illusion. It just doesn't happen. So big important point on the transaction fee business. All right, productizing a service is like the services business, but you're buying a SKU in an outcome versus an hours. So give you a case in point, I'm on the board of a company that does financial services. So they help you take money from your retirement account and invest in your own business without paying the taxes and fees, right? So distinct for the US market. The customer is buying an outcome, right? But behind the scenes, there's people who are doing the work, there's technologies who are doing the work. The customer doesn't care, right? Unlike a law firm, which is a services business, in this case, the customer is getting an outcome and they don't care if it's technology or people. So the big thing on this one is you want to keep your gross margins greater than 35 or 50%. It works in both B2B and B2C. There's another company here in Seattle called Moz, or SEO Moz, and they originally did services work, right? And then as they built their tools, and then they shifted the people from the services business off to a different business, and they just became in the tools for SEO, right? So they use that as the bridge going from services to product as a service to a product. So this one's really interesting because most companies who start with productizing or services or productize a service never really make the leap to being a product company, right? And clearly there's a big difference in the multiple of being a product business versus a services business. So, but that's product as a service. Pavel, you had a question?
Yes, you have mentioned several times that we can put our prices high and then offer a discount for the first year. Should we put this discount on our landing page so everybody could see it, or like tell it only during direct sales?
Yeah, we'll definitely cover it in detail in the pricing breakout, but in general, this is because of likely the number of customers who are hitting your page. In the early days, you're going to be the one negotiating with them. So I would put pricing there first. If you feel like you're getting traffic at the site and nobody's converting, then I would put up a basically an offer page, but I would start to do A/B testing, and we'll talk about the A/B testing here in a little bit as well. So the question is in the early days, you're typically doing outbound sales and marketing. So I'm going to take 2 price sheets, virtual or physical, with me on that sales call. And based on how the sales call is going to go, I'm going to give you the higher price, or if the sales calls, I'm feeling like it's not going very well, I'm going to give you the lower price, because I don't have enough traffic on my site to do A/B testing, right? So what I'm after there is I want to kind of look in people's eyes and see if their pupils dilate. Are they excited about what we do, or they're like, meh, right? So if they're meh, I'm going to offer them a lower price, right? I'm going to come out and lead with, hey, we're going to be this amount per year, per user, but because you're an early beta customer, it's 50% off for the first year, or 30% off for the first year. But I want to do that as many one-to-one as I can to test out my pricing. If people aren't pushing back on your pricing a little bit, like, oh, that's too high, like, then you're probably pricing it just too low, right? But I want to get that reaction from people, right? When I do a consulting project, a couple of these big consulting projects, I come out at a really high price, right? And if they react, I'm like, yeah, I'm willing to negotiate a little bit on scope, right? But if they don't react, the answer is, I priced it too low, right? So what I'm trying to establish is I always want to push the high end if it's possible. The challenge for us as founders is we know the products, we know its idiosyncrasies, we know where it's not ready, right? So my analogy for that, Pavel, is like, I could show you a picture of my son Brandon when he was 2. He's 28. It would be true, but not very accurate, right? And as your product changes, you have to be able to capture that value, right? And if you start too low, it's a challenge to get the price up, right? Because your customers' expectations are like, oh, they just doubled the price. And you're like, no, I set the expectation we're going to double it, and you're getting the discount in the first year. So that's kind of the way I'd approach it. Because if you're not getting a little bit of pressure on like, it's priced too high, you're probably priced too low, right? And there's so many things you can run into in this process. I want you to at least have the most opportunity for revenue. All right, so that's number 6, product as a service. Number 7 is marketplaces. Lots of marketplaces, Etsy's, eBay, Alibaba. They work both B2B and B2C. Their key metrics are the average transaction amount, the number of monthly transactions, and the commission percentage on the transaction. So keep in mind the big difference here is you look at the marketing side is you have 2 funnels. You have a funnel for sellers, and you have a funnel for buyers. So we'll talk more about those funnels after lunch, but the bad news is you have 2 very distinct sales funnels. The good news is if you can build that up, there's an intrinsic moat and defensibility in the business. The challenge is you have to track the marketing effort completely differently for sellers versus buyers. And if you track them both together, it's a mess, right? Because you can't pull the data out to actually have it be useful. Again, challenges here to start with 2-sided marketplaces versus multi-sided marketplaces, right? In some ways, Etsy today is a B2B to C business, right? And if you start talking about multi-sided marketplaces early, my eyes will roll back in my head, because I need you to be successful in two-sided marketplaces first before you worry about multi-sided marketplaces. Remember, we talked yesterday about the difference between launch and scale. So this is a great example of the difference between launch and scale. So that's marketplaces, that's number 7. All right, number 8 is combinations. So think of, if I'm a marketplace that charges a subscription fee, if I'm a subscription business that charges professional services. So these combination models are interesting outliers, in that we looked at the data and how fast they matured, and we basically took plotted out all of the 2,654 companies based on from seed round to A round on the bottom axes, and from A round to B round on the side axes, and we plotted them out on the math. And combinations actually matured about 4 times faster than the average, because early revenue, so for example, services revenue to do a deployment was early indication of revenue before the trailing indication of subscription revenue, right? So again, don't argue with VCs about this one, but know that if you have early proof points in terms of revenue, those models mature faster. So it's just it's a good example. So that's combinations. And I think you should look at it and go like, if I have combinations, I have a thesis that we're 75% subscription and 25% services. Versus if you're inverted, if you're 75% services and 25% subscription, I'm going to be like, not a great example for funding, right? So some of you may be able to do non-recurring engineering early and build towards your final product, but charge your customer for a custom build of that product. Is that sustainable over the long term? It's not ideally where you want to be, because I want you to be in a product business versus a services business. However, if it validates the point and it funds your operations, it's not so bad either. Okay. All right, so that's number 8. So these ones start getting a little more obscure here going forward, and some of them only work at scale. So I'm going to give you some nuances of how they work as we move forward. So lead gen is number 9. So if you know Mint, the new one, let me pull the new one's name. So sorry, that's not it. So there's a new version of Mint on. Let's just see if I can find it here. Chime is the new one. So what Mint and Chime both did was they get a referral fee. So for you guys doing Zywa, it's the same business that you guys are doing, right? Which is we provide access to banks, but the banks pay us for referral fee for bringing us new customers. So the lead gen business is a highly competitive business, but it's easier to bootstrap because there's big affiliate partners who are willing to pay you to do leads. So in the US market, we've seen it basically track to, if you think about Google AdWords spend at the highest level going backwards. So mesothelioma, right, and life insurance and auto insurance and legal. And so high value AdWords for Google, if you can do marketing and capture those ads and those leads cheaper than the company who actually fulfills the work, then what you have is a lead gen business. But no, it's highly competitive, right? So banks typically will pay for a lead, or in this case, a form data, which has Dave's information, his phone number, and his email. If you can generate that lead for half the price the banks will pay for it, you have 50% gross margins. So it's a good example of a business. That's the one you guys are in for lead gen. Chime is the new example of that in the US market that just sold recently. So it works B2B and B2C both. It tends towards B2C because you're capturing consumer leads and then selling those consumer leads to banks as an example. So good business model, just highly competitive. All right, anybody doing gaming? I don't remember hearing a pitch deck yesterday from gaming. So you guys know Candy Crush. So a friend of mine sold his company to Candy Crush for $150 million. It's a hit-driven business. The margins on virtual swords are amazing. right? Because you can make that virtual sword once and sell it 1,000,000 times. So the key metrics here, this one is B2C only, by the way. Number of downloads, percentage of people who play, in-app purchases is your key metric. So if nobody's doing gaming, we put this one aside. All right, next one, advertising and search. Congratulations, this one works, but it only works at scale. So if you don't have 1,000,000 unique users on your site, then you can't use this one until you do. Give you a data point on it. So $35 CPM rate, which is cost per thousand, is a great example of getting advertising revenue for 1,000 views. So my blog today gets between 3,000 and 5,000 people a month who read the blog. With the $35 CPM rate, that's basically going to generate $110 of advertising revenue for all of my traffic. So that's why you need 1,000,000, right? So it's a good revenue model. However, you have to show me how you're going to get to 1,000,000 users. Is that going to cost you $1 million or $2 million, right? So know that advertising is a valid model, just not at launch. It's only a valid model at scale, okay? So your key metrics there are traffic, percentage of clicks, average revenue per click. It's pretty simple math. And I'll walk you through the comps on Google and Facebook. New media versus old media. So think Snap versus Mashable, right? So the new media model in WhatsApp or Snap is B2C only. This is the one when somebody says, we're going to go viral. This is what they mean. Viral is what's called K-factor. It's the viral coefficient. Sadly, a year and a half ago, now people understand what it is. So it used to be, it took some explanation, but now it's like, oh, for every paid user you get, how many people will they invite and how many will convert? If you get a conversion factor of greater than 2, then you're in rare air. So in my 20 plus years of doing startups, I've worked with one company that had a viral coefficient of greater than 2. It was 2.03. I mean, it was just barely, but it was pixie dust and rainbows and butterflies and magic and unicorns, and it was crazy. So that was a company we sold for $156 million in cash. So I was just on the board. I wasn't a founder. If I was a founder, I'd be retired now and I'd be sitting on the beach somewhere.
Would you say that Clubhouse went viral?
Which one?
Clubhouse.
Well, Clubhouse definitely went viral based on the customer acquisition, though they haven't started the monetization strategy on it. But this is kind of the anti-revenue model, right? If your growth metrics are like Clubhouse's were, or Facebook's early days, or WhatsApp's, the answer was, we know you're going to monetize on advertising at some point. But that's not the critical factor. The critical factor is what's your growth and your K-factor and viral coefficient. So for every person that got invited, how many people did they refer and how many people converted and came back is your key metric for viral. Which you're spot on, but Clubhouse is it. So, but when somebody says they're going to go viral, this is what they mean. It's only B2C. So the one example of B2B was LinkedIn for about a 6-month window back when they introduced the tool to do, to upload your entire contact list out of Outlook or out of Apple. So there was about a 6-month window. Their viral coefficient went to greater than 2 and then trailed back down. So if you create a B2B viral coefficient, like, let me know, I'll write you one of your first checks. I've just never seen it done, right? And it's only a few thousand companies I've looked at, so I'm sure that there maybe will be one out there. So K-factor is hard, right? And it's not, you can plan for it, right? But it's not something you can forecast, right? There's a little bit of a magic in a bottle. So, so that's number 12. 13 is big data. Big data, like advertising, it works at scale, but it doesn't work at launch. So if your plan is to monetize the data, great. Patients Like Me as an example. There's lots of big data companies these days. I think of them as, I have the proprietary data set that I can run something against, but again, I have to have the data set before I can monetize it. So super valid model, just know that the difference is significant. And then 14 is licensing. So those are your 14 models. Think Microsoft Office. I can still do a license for a territory or geography, as an example. So I may sell, like with my first startup, we knew we'd never get to the Japanese market. So we sold a license to that region. So it could be a regional license or field of use license. So they invested in the company, took the company to Japan and Asia. We were never going to get there anyway, and they paid us to do it. So that was the simplest version of a license. And licensing still works for software today. It's been overshadowed by subscriptions. All right. So pick your primary and secondary revenue models. After you picked them, please put it in the chat window because I'm super curious to see what you all pick.
Hey Dave, I had a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
Dave, we have a revenue model through which we have a revenue sharing partnership with the bank. What does that mean? For every customer we bring to the bank and every dollar he deposits, the bank gets 8% as interest on that from lending it out, and we take a 10% of the 8% and share that with the bank. Which model does it go under that?
So the lead gen with a marketing expense.
Yeah.
So your lead gen would be that the percent affiliate commission that you get, and the marketing expense would be the amount that you pay back to the bank. So again, let me pull back a level and tell you the way I'm thinking about it. I always think about these in the terms of a spreadsheet. So okay. when I put your revenue model into a forecast, I think of it as how do I take those two things? So I'm going to say every new customer has a dollar amount of value as a lead gen, and then I'm going to assign a percentage of that bank or a percentage of that fee to my marketing expense, because it will vary over time. So every new bank you sell to, that margin rate will shift a little bit, right? Right. So that's the way I would put it into my forecast, would be revenue per user, right, okay, as an affiliate with marketing expense going to the bank. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, thanks.
Yeah, when you think about this in context of a spreadsheet, that ultimately, the thing that I like about revenue models is it forces you to go from, I have this concept and hand wavy thing, to like, I have to pick numbers that go into a spreadsheet. Because when you have to do that, you're like, oh, it has to get very specific, right? It actually gets very tangible.
And Dave, why would it say to just pick two? I mean, if there's some revenue model which works without your interference on it, like a transaction model, why would it say just focus on two? Why not three? Is there any rationale?
Great question. So early days, the dilemma is you don't typically have enough capital to do more than one, but you need to know what you're growing toward. At scale, Uber has multiple revenue models, right? But at launch, you're really limited based on your access to capital and confusion for the customer. So know that in the early days, you're going to focus on a primary. You'll have an option as a secondary, and as you scale, you'll have optionality to expand it. But early days, it's really about focus.
Dave, would hardware rental also fall under subscription, like bundle package?
So the way you would do that in the spreadsheet is you would do hardware commerce with gross margins, and a subscription is a percentage of total revenue. So you may look at it in your case as an IoT device and say, well, we're going to sell 100 IoT devices in one subscription. But the way you would break it out on your forecast is hardware sales commerce, subscription sales recurring revenue based on average revenue per user.
Got it.
That makes sense?
Got it.
Right. I see a bunch of combinations. That's interesting, actually. I worry that it taint you guys, because when you go talk to a VC, just tell them your lead one. Don't tell them their combinations. Like, our lead one is this. All right, I want to share with you a screen. Any questions before I'm going to give you some other outside data that we're building? Any questions about you're not sure what revenue model yet, or you think you have an entirely new revenue model, which I'm always curious about. It's like discovering a unicorn. So versus criticizing. So if you have a new model, feel free to share it as well. But questions about your revenue model choices? Okay. All right.
Can I ask a question?
Of course. That's why I'm here.
Yeah. Reem here from Nadira. So we have a subscription fee. So we charge municipalities per household that subscribe with us, but we also charge them an incentive fee for the waste that we help them divert from ending up in landfills or whatever. Does this count, this incentive fee, does it count as a metered
Maybe
model
the
or
question
not?
is can you give them the forecastability and predictability?
Yeah,
or is
yeah,
it
they track it on a dashboard. Yeah.
so yes, is the answer.
Okay.
Yes, and maybe it could be a transaction fee, right?
Mhm.
So and it might be if you can forecast it appropriately and give the right visibility to it, it could be a metered service.
Okay.
You know, like I said, metered. We're still at the early days of metered services, but if there's a way you can forecast that, if it's an incentive for them, it's probably a cost to you versus if it's something you charge them, it would be more of a metered service, right? So
No,
do I get
actually,
money
yeah,
back?
maybe naming is wrong, but it's
Like-
not a cost for us, it's our profit actually.
Okay, so you get additional revenue for that product.
Yeah, because it's our main result or outcome from our service.
Got it. So then I would say we have a subscription fee, and then I would say your secondary model is metered service, but you definitely need to train your customer, right? The hard part about metered service is the customer has to be willing to pay. So in the early days, if you just start with subscription and then as you're able to prove that out, the customer will pay extra for it as you go, then you can go to a metered service.
Yes, 100%. Like in Lebanon, we don't charge the metered service. We wouldn't charge for the incentive fee.
Right.
Just because it's a social thing. But in our, like in UAE or whatever, of course we're gonna do that.
Yeah, I'm glad that I'm glad you can charge for it at all in Lebanon, because it's such a weird time for Lebanon. So
Yeah.
you guys will meet Fauzi at some point. Fauzi's the MD for the Lebanon program for Flat6. So I was there and did this program in person for them. And the first night I was there was the night that the civil unrest started, which was super weird.
Nice.
Who knew I could have waited just like a year and done it at home in Seattle? Right?
Yeah.
All right, so I want to just give you some comps here to
Dave, I have a question, if I may, Dave.
Dave's another question.
How do you determine your primary model versus secondary? What determines a primary? Is it the revenue size, or is it? I mean, what would you define?
Yeah, I would say it's really where you're going to launch and where you think your thesis is the biggest portion of your revenue. So if you think it's going to be subscription, then make subscription your primary. If you think then we're going to add services or transaction fee, like you may never get there. It may be you may have one and that's fine, right? And there's lots of examples in the public comps that like Twilio has only one. It's just metered service, right? Salesforce has multiple now, right? So they started with subscription, but they also do overages, so that are usage based. But those are generally felt more like penalties, right, for overage usage than incentives like Twilio. So it's more so that you all can think about it in the standpoint of like, this is how we're going to focus and we're going to see how it works. But if it doesn't work, we're going to look at how we pivot to the slightly different model. Because again, it's customers have to be willing to buy, right? So you can't, there's power asymmetry with your customer relationships early days. So it has to be around their willingness to pay, where if you're a big company, you can force models, right? Because the customer doesn't have a choice. But you should have your primary should be your lead where the majority of your revenue is. Yep.
Thank you.
Dave, a question. What would be the difference between the commerce and the marketplace, comparing the two?
Yeah. So the difference is you have to recruit buyers and you have to recruit sellers in a marketplace. Where if you're just doing commerce, you're just recruiting a customer. So I'm going to have a cost of customer acquisition, and we'll get into these after lunch. So I have what's called my CAC, right? So my customer acquisition cost to acquire a customer. That customer is going to do a transaction value with me, and then they're going to do a lifetime value. How many transactions will they do a year, as an example? So if it's at $300 times 4 transactions a year, it gives me my lifetime value. In the case of a marketplace, I have to recruit sellers to sell that $300 product, as well as the buyers to buy that $300 product. So I have 2 marketing funnels in the case of a marketplace.
Okay, sure. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, of course. So Alak, I see your hand up.
Yeah. So Dave, if I have two revenue models right now, and I'm planning to have another one in the next 18 months when I scale, yeah. So in the market sizing slide, do I include a third revenue model to determine the market size and to show that this is the total potential in the next 18 months, or should I just stick to the two?
I think
When
as
I'm
long as, so the answer is it depends, right? So if your market size is big enough without introducing the new product, then I would stick with just that. If you're introducing a new product where you have a reasonable amount of assurance that you'll hit that product deadline, then you can talk about your TAM being a combination of those things as you grow. It's really a question of the perception of focus, right? Because if your TAM is big enough and you can launch that first product and get traction, the answer is you have lots of optionality, right? Because you have revenues and customers. So adding a new product, as long as it's not an entirely new product line where people are like, I don't understand how those two things fit together. If however, they're super complementary and it's easy for the investor to understand, I'd lump them together up front, right? It just depends on how difficult the story is to tell. If you make the story difficult to tell, right? So this is an example. Investors are like all customers. Confused customers don't buy, right?
Yeah.
So simplifying the message is always important. Okay, other questions about revenue model choices before I, okay. Let me do.
By the way, Dave, how many revenue models can be there which are actually practical? There could be a combination of 2 or 3.
Probably just 2 to start, mostly
Okay.
because of, again, back to the focus topic. At the early days, investors wanted it. So there's a common conception in venture capital that you should just pick a revenue model and stick with it, right? Okay. Versus combination models as an example. At scale, you can have multiple revenue models, right? But at launch, you typically have, you know, think about each one of these revenue models can have a different sales process. Well, that's super hard to do with limited capital, right, and limited staff. So your value propositions have to be super crisp as well. So your marketing messaging has to be super crisp. So the challenge there is really a challenge of like, at the early days, we're going to focus on this one, and we know we're going to grow this direction, right? So let me show you some of the data here that the investors don't know, but it's super interesting. So you guys see my screen there now with the spreadsheet. So services businesses, Accenture, Stride, et cetera. So what we did is we took the public company comps, and we basically built a list of companies like Facebook, Google, and broke them down where they had clear, distinct revenue models. So I would tell you, we pulled some of the mega cap stocks out. So Amazon, Microsoft, they have multiple revenue models because they, at scale, they do lots of different things. So we looked at the number of acquisitions those companies had made. So part of the thesis here is that at some point you're going to sell your company to an upmarket buyer. That upmarket buyer is likely public, and they have a multiple of revenue that is how they're going to value your company. So we pulled a list of about, it's growing now, about 300 companies globally. And then we put them into a summary. So in the services multiple is $1 million services business is going to sell between $750,000 and $1.5 million. You'll see down here that Snap versus Mashable, Mashable's revenue numbers is 3x revenue, but Snap's revenue number is 23 times revenues. So where you have a choice to set up a model, set up the model that pays better, right? So you'll see lead gen here is 4 to 5 times revenue, right? And again, this is not a judgment of your business is a good business or a bad business. This is a judgment of what's the multiple of revenue that someone's going to pay you. Now, I don't want to overly simplify this, right? Because I want to make sure I give you some of the other components of it too. Your growth number matters. The customer concentration matters. So what I mean by that is, so one of the companies we'll close on selling next month is a company that has one big joint venture partner where almost all of their revenue goes through that one joint venture partner. That drives their, even though it's a subscription business, that drives their value down. But their growth is greater than 40% a year. That drives their value up, right? So versus we sold one company last year that was doing $1 million in revenue, and they sold for $12 million. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to pendulum swing you to pick a particular model here. I just want to help you understand there's a big difference in the exit multiple of what you sell a company for. And there's a difference in your pre-money and post-money value as you go to get funding from folks like Flat6 and others. And you should just know that I'm a big fan of data transparency for founders, because I think there's a lot of information asymmetry as when it comes to funding, right? And this is part of the data that's useful, but not generally publicly available. So unless you're geeky about it, like I am, the answer is no one really knows, right? Which is a little frustrating for me in talking with founders, because I'm like, well, of course you'd want to go do that because it just makes sense, right? And Kit?
Hey Dave, quick question. Productize a service, is that a combination of more than 2 revenue models?
It's usually a
yeah.
service business that is sold as a fixed price. So IBM, for example, if you look at IBM's revenue, most of their revenue comes from professional services.
Sure.
They also sell products, right? So I would say it's typically 1 to 2x on revenue. But if you think about the customer's perception is I'm buying a SKU or a product. From a delivery perspective, there's people involved in the delivery, right? But there are also maybe tools and technologies that drives the price down, right? But productized service is just it's an improvement over services, but it's not like, if I sell a product, and I can sell it when I sleep. If I sell a product as a service, somebody has to be there to help deliver that product. So,
Gotcha. Yeah. Thanks, Dave.
Yep. Marco?
Yeah. Does it make sense to transition from lower conversion model to from a higher to lower, basically like from a transaction fee to a marketplace?
It really comes down to what you guys think your genuine product path is, I think, more than anything else. If you think it's a transaction fee business is where you're starting, and you guys, in your case, it's like, are we going to build a social platform or not? That gets you into, let me show you this other public company comp data. So if I come up here, interestingly enough, here's the ratios for Facebook's, all their revenue is advertising. Google's 92% advertising. This is the multiple on revenue that they get. So here's the quick math, so this chart makes sense. What we took was the enterprise value, which is the market cap, divided by trailing 12 months revenue. And then we looked at it over the prior 4 quarters because the volatility was fairly normalized. So what you have here is, Facebook sells currently for 9.2 times revenues. So you take the trailing 12 revenues times 9.2, and that gets you to the market cap of the company. So there's a pretty tight range there, right, from an advertising business perspective, right? So if you look at the marketplaces vary a lot, because if you're selling your own product, Lululemon, right, or I'm sorry, commerce, if I'm selling my own product and I have higher margins, my enterprise value is higher. If I'm selling somebody else's product, for example, Wayfair or Groupon, right? We talked about Groupon earlier. Look at Groupon's multiple, 0.49, right? Now they're doing billions of dollars in revenue, but arguably it's not GAAP revenue, right? They're selling a $100 certificate for a restaurant, but they're not actually making $100, right? They're making, small percentage fees. So that gets you into the transaction fee / commerce business. Okay.
Okay.
Again, I don't want to over index and give you guys too much data that, if you take this data to a VC and say, this is why my valuation is justified, you'll be wrong. Right. So just know that I'm not trying to set you up for that expectation. I just want you to think ahead into like, okay, if I'm going to spend 7 years to build a company, I want to build it around the multiple that gets me 10x revenue instead of 2x revenue, right? Because it's going to take you 7 to 10 years to build a company anyway. You should get paid well to do it at the end of the day.
Dave, I have a question. These are based on the enterprise value based on a publicly traded companies. So correct. Basically, the appetite for supply and demand on buying the shares from a stock market trading point of view, and appetite for the stock. The challenge I face, the question I have is, when you are a startup and you're trying to compare, I mean, we were faced once with investors and VCs who are asking about our multiples and about our valuation. And when you're a startup, it becomes really skewed in terms of, as you said, it's 7 to 8 years down the line, not today. But how do you take that discussion with such a? I'm sure you've heard that discussion before.
Yeah, for sure. Every deal I've invested in, I've heard the discussion. So let me give you the early information and the later information. Again, this is focused on if you're going to spend 7 years building a company, right? So when I launched the book, one of the guys who did a pre-read for me is a CFO for hire, right? So he has a big consulting practice that does interim CFO work. And after he read the book, he called me and said, "I'm kind of pissed off." I'm like, "Why are you pissed off?" He's like, "You reminded me that after 14 years of work, I'm going to sell this company for 1 times revenue." Right? I'm like, "I'm just reporting the facts. I'm not actually, I didn't make them," right? So he's a good friend, right? But he sold his company. It was a great exit for a services business. Now, had he built a subscription business, right, it would have sold for 12 times revenue, right? So my point here for you all is not to improve your negotiating with Ryan on your any other investor, is to help you understand, like, I want to get, like, one of the companies I'm on the board of, we were a services company and we became a product as a service company. Now we're trying to build out the tech platform to sell as subscription, because we recognize that, like, oh my gosh, the value on that piece of the business, even if it's only 25% of our total revenue, is a disproportionate outcome for the value of the company, right? So we're using our money from the services business to build into a technology platform. Versus if you're at the early stage, do that early rather than wait to have the aha moment to do it, right? To answer your evaluation question, so early on, what happens is your company is really based on what we talked about yesterday, your TAM. So in the earliest days, it's about the TAM and the team and the traction. And I'm totally making a bet, not based on multiples of revenues, EBITDA, earnings, none of that data matters.
No DCF model, no comparables, no.
Right, because you don't have any of those, right? I can't give you a PE ratio because you have no earnings, right? It's a multiple of 0, it's infinite. So in the early days of the company, your valuation is based on, wow, this is a big ass TAM. The team is awesome and they have a super sticky product. Okay, I can give you, there's a thing called the Berkus method. Now keep in mind, the Berkus method is designed around West Coast tech companies, not MENA tech companies, because you've got a discount. Here, give you some data that we ran recently as well. If I use Seattle as 100% as the average markup of a Series C to 2 or Series A round, the average Seattle Series A round is $8 to $12 million. The average Valley A round is $12 to $18 million. The average MENA A round is $3 million. So you're basically at a significant discount, right? Just based on your geography. So which is why you have to tell the story of why this is a global company instead of a local company, right? So, but early days, you're based on a hypothesis. And your hypothesis is it's a big TAM, it's super sticky, and we're the right team. As investors, we look at it and we're like, yeah, sounds about right, right? But it's not based on forecasted revenue and EBITDA. And now, as you get to your Series A, that data matters a lot. So my conversion metrics, my unit economics, we'll talk about all those after lunch. But the idea is early, it's totally a swag, right? I'm like, hey, we're gonna do $1 million on a $3 million cap. Okay. So my analogy for you, and we'll talk more about investor profiles tomorrow morning, but my analogy for you is just, are you on the pitch, right? So there's the pitch, right? I've got my goals, I've got my sidelines. There's the stands, and then there's the street. So if I'm on the pitch, it's kind of okay. If I'm in the stands, then the investors are going to be like, feels too high, right? And if I'm out in the street, the answer is, oh, you're delusional, right? You think you're a unicorn, but you're not, right? So we'll talk about valuations tomorrow and kind of how to think about it as far as, because the early stage, if you give me as an angel investor terms I can say yes to, safe note, reasonable price, I'll probably just write you a check. Later stage, when you get to institutional investors as a VC, I'm going to tell you the valuation based on your data, because it's important for me to price the company.
Right.
So early stage, you can do what's called a party round, right? If your price is reasonable, right, then I'll be like, oh, I'll write you a check for 50 grand. Sounds like it's kind of interesting. If I'm writing you a check for 500 grand, I'm going to set the terms of the deal as the lead investor. So, and we'll go through more of that in detail tomorrow. Those are things that tend to be less in your control, where things like revenue models in your control, pricing is in your control, marketing is in your control, right? And the more that you prove out those proof points, the more you take the risk away for the investor and the higher your valuation goes. So think of them as like, there's things in your valuation that are in your control, all the things I mentioned, and there's things that are out of your control, which is my average check is $750,000 at the venture fund. My average check at the family office was $1 million. At the venture fund, I would lead, but at the family office, we would never lead. We'd only follow somebody else's lead, right? Because we just didn't want it's a super high net worth individual. We didn't want the target on our back, right? We didn't, even though I've had plenty of experience leading rounds, we just wouldn't do it. So again, we'll expand on it tomorrow morning. We'll talk about pricing and metrics that matter after the break here as one of your variables that's in your control. So good question. There's a couple hands up, so I'm gonna go to those ones, and then we're gonna get ready to take a break here too.
Hi, Dave, thanks for that. Very, very interesting on the multiples. I just want to confirm, when you talk about subscription, I feel, and it's mostly related to B2B businesses, right? Like Salesforce and Spotify, Salesforce and so forth. But what we're doing, for example, is in the food side. So we're putting subscriptions on healthy meal plans and a food solution. So would the multiples still be the same? Do the same similar kind of metrics apply to the food industry versus like a typical B2B offering in the subscription place?
So they do. B2B versus B2C multiples are different, right? And so Spotify is a good example. The enterprise value of Spotify is significantly less as a multiple of revenue than B2B, just because the average transaction value is lower. And the way you change that is looking at your lifetime value. So if my lifetime value on a consumer side gets super long, right, then I can increase that enterprise value. Or if you're selling in you tier that pricing out, and we'll talk about tiering here in a little bit. So can I tier the pricing so I can get more revenue per individual customer over time, right? So, but overall, B2B average revenue per user on a B2B tends to be significantly higher. So consequently, the multiple is obviously higher as well.
Oh, thank you.
And Kate, is there still another question, or did I not put your hand down after the last one?
I'm sorry, it's been a while since I raised my hand. Just let me gather my thoughts. I'll probably raise them again.
No worries. And you can just go off mute and ask the question too. You don't have to. No worries about the hands.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Dave. So just a quick follow up on Varun's question. When we do a multiple round, multiple on the valuation, do we categorize it by industry, because fintech would be different from e-commerce? Like, would there be a variable on that front?
Ask that one more time. I'm not sure I'm tracking with you.
So sometimes when you say, let's say subscription business has 5 times multiple, does it vary by industry? Because e-commerce would be different from fintech, yeah? So how do you, put that into perspective?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's definitely ranges, right, in all of these. And again, there's multiple factors here. Growth is a factor. Sales cycle is a factor. Customer concentration is a factor. But you can look back at the banking comparables of, and I think I'll have to go back and see if I have data for you on, there's not a lot of lead gen companies that are publicly traded, right? So the 4 to 6x multiple, there's just not a lot of lead gen companies that are public. So they tend to get acquired and put into bigger companies, right? Which is fine, right? But it's also one that you don't end up with, like, there's not a lot of data points. Subscriptions, obviously, tons of data points, both B2B and B2C. So it's interesting, but I don't know that I have enough public data points there for you to be relevant, right? So let me wrap up here on a topic, and we'll go to the coffee break. The data that I showed you is useful as you think about you as founders spending the next. So you guys know DocuSign at this point?
Yeah.
DocuSign. So a friend of mine started DocuSign. So it was a 16-year overnight success story. Right. So the angels invested in it 16 years before it went public. Now, if they held the money, right, the people who put in at 25 cents, the stock went public at 32 bucks a share. And because it's the ultimate COVID stock, it went to 260 and it's trading about 200 right now. Massive freaking return. Now, still took 16 years, right? So the reason I bring that up is the valuation of the early days is set by what your investors see as, how big is the market opportunity for this? So the relevant data points for you as it relates to getting funded and getting in the program, right? Because the thing that always scares me about sharing this data with people is like, you guys go back to Ryan and you're like, I think my company's worth $200 million. I'm like, no, it's not. Like, please don't hurt yourself with this data, right? What I want you to be able to do is like help inform how you guys think about growing the business over the long haul, not like stub your toe on the short-term negotiations in the near term. So please hear me with that one. At the same time, you don't want to do what we're doing with Guidant, which is now after the company's been around for 25 years. No, not 25. I've been on their board for 18 years. It's the longest I've ever done anything other than be married, right? And the company will do 32 million in sales this year. Creates a great dividend, but we're the biggest company in our niche, which means other than buying other companies, there's no really great place for us to exit. So we're going to use the cash that we're generating right now to build a subscription-based business that has a higher multiple. So my point there to you is don't wait 18 years to do that, right? In the earliest stages, go try to do those things earlier rather than later, right? So I bring that up because a little bit of data will, taint you guys in a particular direction. And you're like, well, Dave said this. And I'm like, don't, this is hard enough without you taking some of my data out of context. I'm just simply saying, pick a revenue model that's the best one for you to have less friction with your customers. It's easy for the customer to say yes. Grow the revenue over time in a significant way, right? And know that when you go to sell the company at a future date, that this will have an impact on how you sell the company for what price. So I'm trying to compartmentalize those things, but inform your future decisions as well. When I do this for early stage program, we do a monthly program for 6 months. We get to the end of the 4th month and people have to pick their revenue model. And they're like, oh, my cost of sales is super high. My cost to build is super high. My revenue model's not great. I guess I'm going to take all the stuff I learned and go do a different business. Awesome. Congratulations. I saved you 3 years of your life. You guys are way more mature than that, right? So picking which revenue model really matters as far as the outcome you're going after for the business. Okay. Is that a decent summary? So you guys won't go like hurt yourself with the data I just gave you? Okay.
Just as a question in terms of informal data, how many companies startups that you've seen or worked with have pivoted? Is 100% of companies pivot that you initially get involved with in the early stage?
I would say it's probably in the 40 to 50% range.
Right.
So, and by that pivot, it could be like we took the same product and we applied it to an entirely new market, or we really like this market, but we realized the product we're building was the wrong product. Right. So that's typically the two choices in a pivot, and we'll talk about pivots tomorrow. But know that in general, the topic there is, the business is going to grow and iterate over time as you find customer needs and nuance, and how the customer engages with you will change over time. So you may have a thesis today that's like, we're going to sell this product, and you're like, oh, we ultimately did sell that product, but we had to sell this product first. So I think about those as what's an on-ramp product? How do I get the customers to say yes? And then what do I sell next and next? Right. So I think about that more as product planning, right? Because it's really what's the next product I'm going to sell them that helps me increase my lifetime value, right? And after lunch, we'll come back and break down your sales funnels and your go-to-market plans. Because what you'll find is if the customer's saying no to you and you're pushing this ball uphill for the next 6 months and you're not getting traction, then 6 months is about my limitation of like, I'm either I'm double down and I'm growing in 6 months, or I'm going to pivot, right? Because I would rather have you pivot before you run out of cash than go all the way to the end of the runway and be like, oh, the plane's going to fall off the edge. Like, that's just not a good option, right? So I'm a big fan of kill bad ideas fast, not fail fast. I think there's a distinct difference there. And part of it is I don't come from money. So all the money I've made is money that, you know, from ideas that I've created. So I'm super scrappy about it. And I'm always like, this, you know, if you're not getting results in the time frame you expect, then I'm highly skeptical, right? Okay, so you picked your revenue model, a little bit of valuation discussion, which is healthy, but you're not gonna hurt yourself with the data, so I can go to my coffee break and feel good about it. At one point, we had a discussion with one of the other Flat6 teams, and we were talking about the Burkus method, which I would encourage you to look at. Dave Burkus is a guy who wrote it 25 years ago. You know, so it's a good company with a big TAM. The valuation is X. It's a this for that. It's the valuation is plus this. But they were West Coast companies, right? And one of the teams went back and said, we think our valuation should be higher. And they didn't take the investment. And ultimately, I don't know how they did. But like, again, that's West Coast data. And you're in a market that's 22% of what would Seattle's market would be. So yeah, if you moved your company to Seattle, you would get a higher valuation. Is that good or bad? I don't know, right? But right now you're in the market you're in. So the answer is you're going to take the terms that you find most agreeable, right? And multinational cross-border investors are pretty damn rare, right? Because the folks that see so if you took the same company in Seattle and went to the Valley, you would increase the value, the enterprise value by roughly 35%.
So
in a post-COVID world, that you would argue that it probably is the same, right?
yeah. So that means like the place you're in determines your valuation, albeit the fact that you know your actual evaluation.
Yeah. So, and in the early days, there's that information asymmetry, Moses, is super huge, right? So I know as the VC, the deals I've seen, invested in, and missed. You as the founder only typically know your deal. So that information asymmetry is if you are selling friends and family stock, right, you have information asymmetry in your side. You know more than they do. When you go to a VC, they know more than you do, right? So I'm all about how do you level the playing field is important to me because I'm kind of a founder first guy. But just know that the valuation based on your location matters a lot. So if you move your business from where you are today into Abu Dhabi, that either moves up or down your valuation depending on where you're coming from.
No, okay.
So I think it's an advantage as well. Yeah. All right, so we're gonna take 15 minutes now, take a quick coffee break, reload, take a break, stretch. We'll see you back in 15 minutes and we'll talk about pricing and metrics that matter, okay?
Thank you.
Or it's time to start.
Yes, and now that you know this being recorded, you can ask away.
Thank you. So my question is basically related to everything that has been mentioned previously. So yesterday I was also preparing for a pitch and I started doing a precise market research of MENA region in terms of EdTech and MarTech for retail chains. And I'm just curious to know, when we are talking about MENA, what countries do we normally include, especially in the program of this accelerator? Does it also include like Israel or not, or like Turkey, Iran, etc.?
Yeah, I think it depends on where you think you can sell to based on currency and language, right? So if you can, when I think of GCC, that's pretty narrowly focused. So it's like, do I need a certificate to be in Saudi? Can I sell in local currencies? Is it going to be in Arabic? Is it going to be in English? So you're gated more from that standpoint around who can buy based on currency options, credit card options, etc. So think about it that way, and then size your market accordingly, right? Where you're like, hey, we're launching in this because it's going to be in Arabic and it's going to be in this currency, and that's our starting point. But we see where we can quickly get to these additional markets within MENA based on what your actual limitations are, right? With the stuff going on in Israel and Palestine and all those things right now, it's like we may just say we're going to avoid that for right now, right? Or you may look at it and go like, no, that means there's a great opportunity to do it. Whatever the story arc is, be prepared to tell the why behind it, right? but your TAM has to be like, generally speaking, MENA is a fairly large region, but it represents, 16% of the GDP of the US or whatever the statistic is. So you could always take the data from the US and draw some conclusions based on the size of the market region.
Got it.
Okay. All right, any last questions before we move on to pricing? There's always questions, so it's okay. And you're always welcome to ask at any point as we go, okay? Okay, so let's talk about pricing, and I want to give you kind of a walkthrough of how to think about it at the early stage that you're at, and how to think about being systematic on how you engineer pricing. So, because there's a lot of, I find that a lot of founders go into this, and the data. So when I wrote the book, there were two big chapters that I wrote afterwards, after we did this as a seminar about 6 times. One was a section on ideation, because somebody came to the very first session and like, this is awesome and it's super inspirational, but I don't have an idea. What do I do? And I'm like, part of me was like, how did you get here? Because I've never suffered from a lack of ideas. I've always suffered from too many ideas and not enough focus, right? So that's my entrepreneur journey dilemma, right? So I actually wrote a chapter about how to think about structuring ideas, what makes a good idea. The other one was around pricing, because one of the things we noticed in the research was most startups didn't change their pricing in the first 3 years, which is really weird. And they didn't really engineer the pricing. They kind of like took a best guess. So I ended up writing a chapter on pricing as well, because I didn't find much that was written about it. So from a pricing perspective, just know that your price is going to be wrong, because that'll lower your anxiety and you'll just go make some decisions, which is important. So a lot of founders are trying to make it perfect. And my reference yesterday to Bezos is, his goal at Amazon was to make a decision when he had 70% of the information, not to take the time to get to 90%, let alone take the time to get to 100%. So when you have 70% of the information, you can make an informed decision. So know that your pricing will be wrong, and you're going to change it multiple times. Now, you're not going to change it every quarter, but one of the recommendations I'm going to make is you look at it at least a quarterly basis. So how you do that and what you do with your customers as you grow is we'll break down as well. So pricing is a combination of art and science. So it is, I would say that the gut instinct part is okay. Know that you're going to have some gut instinct, and that's fine. But I also want you to have it be informed by data. So, and I see I have a typo on that page, which is crazy. So you're going to use that to find benchmark data. And so that's competitive analysis, market adjacencies, as well as the jobs to be done framework, which we'll talk about from Clayton Christensen. As I mentioned before, don't start pricing too low. You'll probably hear me say that again, because it's such an important factor. And there's a big difference between cost-based pricing and value-based pricing. So cost-based pricing is, I have a $50 an hour bill rate for an employee and $100 an hour bill rate and a $50 an hour pay rate. That gives me 50% margins or 100% markup, right? But that's a cost-based pricing dynamic versus value-based is what can you charge for it, right? And that's where most of you are going to live in the value-based pricing scenario. So your pricing has to cover the cost of building your product, the cost of delivering your product, and the cost of selling your product. So the cost of delivering and support also includes your hosting, your technical support. So think about it from the cost of the building is, here's my engineers, here's my QA, here's my test. All of those bodies have to get paid for with pricing. Now, if you have a SaaS product, it's going to get paid for over years on a monthly fee, but the price still has to be high enough to cover those costs in a reasonable time frame. My cost of supporting and delivering it includes my AWS services, my Azure credits, my technical support. So phone support, chat support, all of those costs have to be included in it. And then my cost of selling basically covers customer acquisition cost, all of my marketing expenses, my marketing team, my sales expenses, and my sales team. So the price has to be high enough to begin to have a path to get a return on that investment. If you price it too low, then you never get a return, right? So if the market conditions say you can't price it and your cost of sale is super high, which we'll get into this afternoon after lunch, know that you're going to have a dilemma on whether this business is fundable or not. So hopefully not your dilemma, but know that those are your variables, right? So if you think about cost-based pricing versus value-based pricing, so I like cars. I'm not a car guy at this point in my life, but the Toyota came out with their new Supra about a year ago, right? And when they came out, the car's retail value was $67,000, but it was available online because of limited supply for $167,000. That's value-based pricing based on scarcity, right? Was the car actually worth $167,000? No, you could just pay, you could just charge for it. For some of you, what you're doing is so unique that customers will pay a premium for it. For some of you, what you're doing is not so unique that customers will be like, yeah, it's okay, right? But if you can charge value-based pricing without price gouging, right? If truly the customer's seeing great value and they don't have an alternate way to get to this customer base. So I think of Zyway, with your example with the banks don't know crap about how to get to millennial customers. So anything you can charge them up into a reasonable price point, right? And by reasonable, I mean what they would be like, we're just going to hire somebody to do this because it's too expensive. So I'll give you a parallel. In consulting, I can charge a markup on my team's time. If I charge 50% markup or 100% markup, it's probably fine. If I charge a 300 or 400% markup, my consultant's going to find a way to go direct to that customer, right? Because the price is too high, the gap is too big. So the thing that you guys have to look at as you look at pricing your product is how much opportunity do I have to mark this up before the customer negotiates the price back down? And most of us, because we know the MVP, we tend to start too low. So where I would encourage you to start higher and test out the high end of the range. Okay? So value-based pricing is what you can do, what you can charge for it. And again, you're thinking about the future value and discounting now, and we'll talk about promotions here in a minute. But know that what I'm really trying to test is what's the perceived value based on what the product does for the customer. Does it save them time? Does it make them money? Does it give them access to a new customer base? Does it help them change the world, right? Whatever it does, I want you to be able to position it with something that says, that gives them clarity, okay? Okay, from jobs to be done framework. So Clayton Christensen was Harvard Business School. He passed away last year, actually. It was very sad. So he's written The Innovator's Dilemma, Innovator's Solution. But one of the things he wrote about was the jobs to be done framework. So it was so good, I just quoted it here and I'll walk you through it. So when we buy a product, we essentially hire something to get a job done. If it does the job well, when we're confronted with the same job, we hire that same product again. And if the product does a crummy job, we fire it and we look around for something else that we might hire to solve that problem. So if your solution takes 20% of somebody's time that they do on a monthly basis and they get paid $5,000 a month, that means that you should be able to charge 20% of $5,000 as a jobs to be done framework. Now, can you charge that? You're not going to be able to get away with that usually because the perception isn't a 1-to-1 ratio. But the idea with the jobs to be done framework is you understand so well what the customer gets that you can sell them on a percentage of savings or a percentage of margin. So in the case of you guys who are building the product to do online commerce, if this opens up a brand new channel for them, the question is, what will they pay to have access to that brand new channel? And what's the charge that you can do for that? Because it's a net new customer they didn't have before. Now, if they have limited inventory, they're going to look at it and say, we're going to push this to our existing channels because we can't make more product. But if they can sell more product, they'd be happy to take more of a revenue hit because it's a net new revenue component, right? So if I can replace somebody's time, I can do that as value. If I'm helping somebody make more money, I can take a percentage of that revenue. The question is, what percentage, right? So you're always guessing, but I just want you to get in the habit of guessing in an informed way and guessing higher rather than lower, okay? So that's the jobs to be done framework. It's one way to think about how you can price it. So when I think about pricing and what goes into your spreadsheet, so you can have an assumptions tab, right? And I'll walk you through the format for assumptions here later, or for the templates. But the way all the templates are done is you have a series of tabs on the bottom. One of them is an assumptions tab. The assumptions tab is going to have product 1, product 2. You may release product 1 today as your MVP, and product 2 may come out in 12 months or 6 months or 18 months. It doesn't matter, right? It matters that you fit it into your product planning, and what you're selling to the investor is, we're releasing product 1 today, we're releasing product 2 in 18 months, we're going to charge $50 a month for product 1 and $100 a month for product 2. The idea here is you have to get past the concept phase and pick numbers and timing to put into a spreadsheet. That's what pricing is, right? So you have to actually pick a price point. So what do I need to do to build that product? What can I charge for that product? Do I do it as a combination of product and services? Like, will there be service and integration and setup fees required? And then can I add those services just for the front end, or are there services that continue? So know that that's kind of the thing I'm playing with from a product and service mix perspective on pricing. I'm then going to take those pricing assumptions and I'm going to start doing A/B testing. If right now you have 0 traffic at your site and you have 0 customers, your A/B testing is going to be done over a Zoom call or at some point over an in-person meeting. I'm literally going to do 2 pricing pages, right? I'm going to do product headline, product body copy, and price lower and price higher, right? So my A/B testing is going to be super simple. I'm going to do a call with Khalid. We're going to talk about the value proposition of what our product will do for him. And based on how the sales call is going, I'm going to share my screen for product position 1 and product position 2. If I think I can sell the higher price point, I'm going to present the higher price point. Everything else on the pricing page is the same. So that's the simplest version of A/B pricing. Now, if I have 1,000 visitors on my site per month, like Eric Reese in the Lean Startup, I can do that testing on using a tool like Unbounce to A/B test my pricing assumptions. What will I need to do that practically? I'm gonna have to take the pricing page down from my site for, let's call it a week. Whatever it gives me a relevant data site. So if I'm getting 100 users a week, I'm gonna take my pricing page and make it unpublic for a week. So I can't navigate it from the top line navigation. I'm gonna create 2 pricing pages for my A/B test using Unbounce. I'm gonna price one at A, one at B. A is always the use case, by the way, if you're not familiar with this language. A is always is your standard pricing. So it's the pricing I have today. B is always my test. Then I'm going to take that traffic and I'm going to send that traffic to 2 different pages. So if I'm buying Instagram ads or LinkedIn ads or search engine optimization or paid search from Google, I'm going to send that traffic to the Unbounce pages. And what Unbounce is going to do is it's going to track the conversion rates, who clicks through, gets to the form to fill out, and actually gets me the information that says, I want to buy it. And based on the click-through rates, Unbounce will automatically optimize that page for you. Now, it could be that you're back to A again. You're still $50 a month for a monthly subscription on a per user basis. It could be that you went to 75 and 75 converted fine, right? But the idea here is you have a hypothesis. The hypothesis is informed by data. Again, the simplest version is I have 2 price sheets. As I grow the company and grow the traffic, I'm going to use tools like Unbounce to test the same thing. And then on a quarterly basis, I'm going to look at those. I'm going to look at pricing on a quarterly basis. What are my competitors doing? What do I think the market will bear? Is anybody pushing us on price to push it down? And I'll look at how do I move it up? As I have traffic, I have to move my pricing away from the public side, test it for a week, could be 10 days, could be 2 days if you have enough traffic. And then I'm going to optimize my price. So at the bottom of your page, you're going to have an asterisk that says prices are subject to change. So a couple notes on pricing. So if you're selling enterprise, right, you have to do a proposal. So big companies will like the term of your pricing to be longer. So one of the companies I'm on the board of does email delivery optimization. So they'll tell you if your list of 10 million people, when's the best time to send Dave an email? When's the best time to send Moses an email? And they're very different based on past open rates, right? So we had a customer called Coca-Cola, and we gave Coca-Cola a proposal, and they came back and said, we know you're going to raise our price in year 2. We'd like to do a 2-year contract. So we basically increased the price by 50%, gave them a 3-year contract option. They took that. Right now, for us as a startup, we're like, why would Coca-Cola pay more? And the answer was, Coke knows that if it works, you're going to jack up their rates the 2nd year. So we just said, okay, we'll just increase the price now by 50% and we'll give you a 3-year contract. Coke was super excited about it. The founder was super excited about it. But our mindset was product out and MVP. Coca-Cola's mindset was, how do we manage our pricing if this works really well? So just know that you have one particular view. The customer may have a different view. Okay. A/B testing matters. If you have very limited traffic, you can't do A/B testing that way. If you're super new and you're doing B2C, I would buy and spend $1,000 on ads and take it all the way through collecting credit card and checkout and see what I can learn, because it'll inform what product I want to ship and what I can pay for it. So remember yesterday we talked about HubSpot. HubSpot's pricing historically has been very all over the map. So they A/B test the crap out of stuff. Like in fact, at some points the design is like not even very great. It looks like they took a table out of Excel and put it on the landing page. So today their pricing is super complex, right? And they have different tiers and different products, and they have marketing automation and they have sales automation. So I'm going to give you a quick example of that from HubSpot today, and then I'll use that as a way to suggest that you guys use that with your competitors to go back and look at their pricing. So HubSpot today, I'm going to change my share. So you'll see that HubSpot's pricing page today, you see products and plans, bundles, sales, marketing, etc. And they have a starter plan here at $45 a month, billed either monthly or annually. If I go back to HubSpot, we'll see if it's faster today. Wow, it's flying today by comparison to yesterday. Who knew? Let's go back to 2016. I'm going to pick the 6th of March and a cached page from that day. I may have spoke too soon. All right, so I'm going to click on their pricing page here. Well, that's not a great layout. Let me do it one more time. Let me hit refresh. All right, so you'll see that their basic pricing plan was $200 a month. Pro was $800 and Enterprise $2,400 versus $45, $832. So HubSpot's one of those companies that tests absolutely everything, right? So they have strong opinions, but they're tested with data. So, so you'll see here they actually had a limited number of contacts. So one of the things they did early on that was super frustrating for me as a user is I couldn't put my entire database into it. Like if I had a MailChimp list of 2,500 companies, I couldn't put it into their basic plan because I got charged based on the number of contacts that were in the data set. So, and you'll see today, their free plan has no limitation on the total number of users. So it changed both their product positioning and their monthly rates. But if I come back next week and their pricing has changed, am I upset about it? Not really. If I didn't sign the contract, prices change. So just know the same thing is true for you. Right? If you're testing pricing today, you may test the pricing both up and down, right? Or you may test your tiers. So this is a great example of tiering. So if you think about your user profile today, so Pavel and I were talking when we came back from the break about the fundamentals of kind of a cohort analysis, right? So he's selling to software developers that build games. There's individual software developers that may create value for their product, but you'd have to de-feature it like the collaboration tools you wouldn't sell to an individual developer because they're not collaborating with anybody. But if I have 5 or 10 users, so I may have down here a super cheap price point for an individual developer, and a price point in the middle for the 15 to 20, and an enterprise price point that I may hide the price on for that one. But I'm going to make it so that somebody can engage with me and start to buy my product today with very limited friction, right? Now, if I come back in 6 months and we introduce new features, maybe the price goes up by 2x, right? And I grandfathered those customers in at the earlier price. But if somebody comes to your page and doesn't take action, are you going to upset them that you raise the price next month? Maybe, but you know what? They weren't a customer, right? So add an asterisk to the bottom of the page and say price is subject to change. And when the customer asks about it and says, hey, I noticed your price was $45 last month and it's $90 this month, it's like, yeah, we decided we were testing pricing and we decided that $90 was the right price point. But I can give you a discount in that first year if you're willing to sign up for a year. So this is all about sales approach, right? And it's all about testing and all about data. So what frustrates me at times as I talk to founders is you'll notice here that they have a free for life plan. That's awesome if you're HubSpot because you have revenue and you have customers. And I can tell you for everybody who signs up for the free for life plan, some percentage of them are going to convert to paid on a particular time frame. You, however, don't have that luxury because you don't have revenue or not a lot of revenue and you don't have a lot of customers. So free for life doesn't work for you. And free for life isn't a price. Free for life is a promotion. Just like freemium is a promotion, just like limited trials are a promotion. So a promotion is something you use to get people to convert, but it's not a pricing plan. So freemium, if you're B2C, basically says, I'm going to take this product and I'm going to de-feature it and I'm going to give it to you for free. So I have both most of my stuff's on a paid version of HubSpot, but I use the free version forever, right? But then I run into friction and gates where I'm like, oh, I'd really like to have that feature, but I have to go to the paid version of it to do that, right? So that's B2C can be freemium as long as you have a robust product. For B2B, typically it's a time-based trial. So in the case of Pavel's tools for developers that build games, if I de-feature that product, I take a lot of the value away. So I'm not going to give them a freemium version. I would give them a time-limited version. So I would let them use the product for free for 60 days or 30 days. The schedule really depends on how long it takes them to engage with the product. If they can engage with it in 30 days, it's a 30-day free trial. In the case of Moz, the SEO tool, it's a 90-day free trial. But after 90 days, you have to pay for it, right? So early adopter, I can give a discount because you're an early adopter. I can give you 50% off this year, 33% off this year, whatever number I want to give you. But again, I'm setting the expectation that price is going to be up here, but because you're an early adopter, I'll give you a discount for now. So I can do a percentage discount. I can extend the term, right? I can tier the pricing, and I may or may not want to grandfather my early users. So I could go back to my early customers and say, hey, I'm just going to grandfather you and you can keep that price forever because you were here early. However, if you release a new version of the product and it has significantly better features, and you may say, but you can't upgrade without changing price. So again, when I think of my 10, 100, 1,000 customers, usually with my first 10 customers, I know all of them because I've sold all of them, right? And I don't want to go back and raise their price. However, if I introduce a significantly better product, I may go back to them and say, hey, we're going to, you can keep on the old price if you want, or you can move to the new product. The other thing you may find is that your early customers, I know we talked pivot at the beginning of this session, your early customers may have been a completely different customer profile than your customers a year from now. And unless you're deciding to keep that code base up, right, you may have pivoted the code base completely and you're like, I don't know that we can support those customers anymore. And it's hard to let those early customers go. But if they're not the customers that fits your ideal customer profile, just know that that's going to be one of the decisions you're going to have to make. It's a quality decision because you're growing, right? But at the same time, it's always hard to let early customers go. All right, so some common errors from pricing: starting too low. You're going to get a thematic for me there. Don't be opaque with pricing for customers. Give them something they can react to, even if it's wrong. I'd rather you do that than be like, call us for price, because they won't, right? They'll just go find a different vendor. Don't know the answer, test the answer. So the thing I would encourage you to do, I want you to have a thesis for sure, but I want you to test it. So the founders I run into are like, oh, I know the product price is going to be this. Like, maybe, right? So have strong opinions, right? Be cautious about positioning as me too, but because as an MVP, it's going to be me too, but we're only less. So you may have a different feature set that is super popular with a particular customer that you may be able to charge more for. Also be careful about non-tiered pricing. So the price is the same for all the customers. One of the products that I saw recently was they do machine learning and artificial intelligence on long form media. So I can do, I could take this tool and apply it to a blog post or apply it to this video. And in this video of an hour, right, or 2 hours, it can pull for me snippets of the video that reference to my social cloud. And the tool is super cool, and I could use it to do social media, except the only pricing plan they had was focused on agency pricing, right? And they're trying to sell to agencies, but I'm like, and they're like, but, and we have to have a demo, right? Because they're like, our sales closing rate with a demo is super high. And I'm like, I just want to put it on my credit card and buy it, right? But I'm not an agency. So there's no price that's relevant for me. So be cautious of one tier pricing and one price for all customers, because not all your customers are the same, right? So be aware that there might be somebody who wants to use the trial version of your product, or the smallest possible version, as a test. Make it low friction, but give them a path to grow. And you can limit it based on the amount of users, or the amount of bandwidth, or the amount of frequent requests and that sort of thing. Okay. So there's some common errors. So where to start? We talked about primary and secondary. Go back and do the competitive analysis based on pricing and history. What is the market conditions of your current competitors? Build your price hypothesis. Start to do some A/B testing. 3 tiers maximum at this stage. Like I don't want to say 4 tiers. And this example of HubSpot with bundles and products and pricing, it's too much, right? Just know that there's too much pricing information there, and I really want you to be able to start with maximum 3 tiers. Look at what your promotions are going to be, and because your promotions are going to be part of your discount that you're going to give in marketing expense as well. So if you get 2 months free or things like that, you're going to put that in the spreadsheet as an adjustment to pricing, right? But you're going to keep your pricing high with the idea that I can create promotions and discounts. All right. Questions about where you're launching your pricing. What are you thinking about for pricing today? I just gave you a lot of information, so you're probably swirling a bit on pricing.
Dave, I have a question about pricing. Too much discount early on, is that a good sign or bad sign in terms of I mean, I've seen companies, for example, offering their product for 80% discount. And that makes me wonder, like, that's a significant discount that you're offering early on. Why?
Greater than 50, I would be concerned. 30, 35, I would be like, sounds like an early adopter price point, right? Greater than 50, I'd be like, that's just weird, right?
Yeah.
But 30 or 35, I'd be like, oh, that's an early adopter price point. Sure. If I go multi-year, great, right? So the question about churn, and your churn numbers are going to be important there too. But ideally, if you've done the market comparisons and you've done the jobs to be done framework, you should be able to come at a number where people are like, yeah, it feels a little high, but it feels like it might be the right price point. And then you're like, and the early adopter price for first year is 35% off. I'd be like, oh, that's actually kind of interesting, but make it a time-based deadline, right? So you have to close by the end of the month, or, right? So increase your opportunity by creating a call to action, right? It's not 35% off forever. It's 35% off through the end of May, right? It could be through the end of June, but that's what you're testing with your promotions as well.
Right. Thank you.
Hey, Dave, I have a question on how do you balance between giving away the product free initially versus getting those first paid users? Both obviously have lots of advantages. With paid users, you can, prove the concept, but with like more people using it for free, you get more roadmap items to add in and more function requests and this kind of stuff. So how do you balance between the two?
Yeah, and Bertrand, are you B2B or B2C?
B2B SaaS.
Okay, so I would look at paid proof of concepts or proof of concepts with commitment levels. Like, so early user adoption matters a lot more in B2C than it does in B2B, other than capturing usage patterns and what you learn from them. So I would look at bounding a proof of concept for time, if I have to do it free, or a bound proof of concept for a minimum price commitment that shows a willingness for the customer to pay for it. As an investor, if you do 5 POCs that are all free and nobody converts, I'd be like, something's wrong with this one. But I also want to know that they have a commitment in the form of some form of cash, because it's going to take your time and your team time to make that POC work. So proof of concepts or pilots, paid pilots, are always something I look at early for B2B. Versus straight user, a user metric tends to be more of a B2C metric, right? Unless there's something specifically you're trying to prove by increasing the number of users.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Dave, can I have a go?
Yeah, go.
Okay, so the problem I'm facing is in the middle of last year, we rolled out a new capability on our product, and we had an early adopter or a pioneer customer whom we were charging $100 annually per subscriber. But now they're out of their 12-month period. They were not given any indication of a price increase, and we intending on tripling that price. So do I go back to them and tell them, listen, the full price was $300, but because you were an early adopter, we gave you a massive discount, and now you will need to pay the full price. From a buyer perspective, how will that person normalize that? And I paid $100 for something now, and I'm paying 3 times as much for the same thing. How do I get that person to cross that bridge?
My first question would be, do you want to keep them as a customer or not?
Yes, yes.
So I would go back to them and say, hey, we're releasing a new set of features. Like, give me a reason for why the price is increasing versus just my TAM expired. So we're releasing a new set of features over the next 6 months. We're going to see, you're going to see the front page pricing go up by 3x. We're happy to transition you into the new pricing over the next year. So if you want to keep them, the question is you want to set their expectation, but give them time to make the migration. But I would say, hey, we'll defer increasing the price to the normal retail rate. It's going to go up by 50% here next year, but I'd really like to use you as a reference account. But I need you to know that everybody else who's coming on is going to pay 3 times what you guys are paying. Or, is that okay for you to be like, oh, we were an early adopter, but we think this, like, help them create value because they have to sell it to somebody within their organization, and then ask them for something in return. Would you help me write a white paper? Would you be a reference account? Like, how else can they help you as you migrate their price in? But give them time to migrate over, unless you're like, nope, there's so many new customers, we don't have to worry about it, right? So help them be a hero with their organization. Everything I talked about yesterday about every marketing message, there's a hero to the story and you're not the hero. So let them be the hero within their org, help them evangelize that message, and then keep them as a customer, right? Because otherwise you may just lose them as a customer.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, Ignacio?
Hi, Dave. My question is, how do you make the decision after making the A/B testing and how it balances with customer acquisition costs? Because finally you are like lowering the margins, going to a P decisions that maybe is lowering your prices, and maybe the customer acquisition cost is less than the margins that you are lowering. So
yeah,
how do you take the decision?
After lunch, we'll go into your go-to-market strategies in your CAC in particular. So whenever you're doing the A/B testing, obviously you're looking for, I won't say it's statistically significant at this point for most of you, right? Because you don't have enough traffic to be statistically significant. So, but what you're looking for is, what did you learn from the product positioning? It doesn't mean you necessarily have to change it. So one of the things I would encourage you to look at on a regular basis is look at pricing every quarter and create a pricing committee, right, of your key team members, and look at pricing every quarter, but it doesn't mean you're going to change pricing every quarter, right? And it could be, but my A/B testing, just to be clear, is my A/B testing is almost always up, not down, right?
Okay.
I'm looking for like, oh, I'm currently at $50 per user per month. I want to test 65, right? Did it change my conversion metrics? In my A/B testing, I'm likely not going to change down unless my volume of users is so much higher and my channels of customer acquisition are so much broader that I can significantly lower my cost of customer acquisition. And we'll talk more about this after lunch, but give you an example. I ran a code training school in Seattle called Code Fellows. Code Fellows was a 20-week program that retrained people in those skills. If you bought all of 20 weeks, it would be roughly a $22,000 LTV, right? Now, our average lifetime value was $16,800 because not everybody did all 20 weeks, right? People would quit after a month or 2 months. But our LTV was 16.6. My customer acquisition cost was $1,580. So my ratio was 11 to 1. So my LTV to CAC ratio is about 11. That number was great. My time to close was ridiculously long, right? So my key metric then became, how do I shorten my time to close metric? Because my LTV to CAC ratio didn't change fundamentally. My time to close went from 92 days to 62 days, right? By aggressively managing that. So most of your price changing is going to be, we were public with price, we didn't change that pricing. What we were really trying to do is shorten the sales cycle, became the bigger variable there that was a lever that we could move, right? So that's part of what you're looking at in all of these tests. And again, you may elect not to change pricing at all, right? Or there may be a significant version build that you're like, okay, we've got a significant new build. In the case of the email company I mentioned earlier, we just released a new product with an entirely different price point and tiering. So something that somebody could do, credit card, self-service, easy to do, super high transaction volume, which is different than the customer's been used to buying from us before in the past. So test pricing up in general though.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. So Dave, a question?
Yeah.
This is Munib.
Go ahead.
Yep. So in the example we were discussing around Productize as a business in a B2B space, with IBM even taking as an example, one of the challenges with the B2B or enterprise space in particularly is with Productize as a service, there is no one size fits all. It will always be specific. It will always be personalized to a customer needs, to an environment, to a challenge they face. And you were also mentioning that the price ideally must be there for the customer to know, obviously, if they're interested or not. How do we find the right balance then, where actually we need the input or insights from them in terms of scoping, sizing, before we actually say, okay, this costs either 1,000 or maybe 100,000?
Yeah, in the early days, you're going to do proposals for those, and they're going to be very educational sales process versus transactional sales process. The thing that I'm driving for to scale that, however, is how do I get the customer engaged in the self-service model without a proposal earlier in the process? So do I create a de-featured product, which is easier to onboard, or is every single project a proposal and a negotiation? So it's fine if it is, right? It's just a different business from a scale perspective. When I think about scaling the business, right, I may look at it like the HubSpot one, which is like, oh, this one's $800 a month and you could get started. But if you're going to go to more users and more, that's like, it's going to be a proposal with a multi-year contract negotiation. But generally speaking, I'm trying to push in the direction of how can I make this scalable rather than how do I just create more proposals every month? Is that helpful?
Okay, sure, got it. Yeah.
Yeah, when I think about product businesses, that comes back to the revenue model. If it's a subscription-based business or a metered service business, then I should be able to look at it and go like, well, I think our usage is about here, so our pricing should be kind of about X, right? Versus everything being, if everything's custom, you probably have a lot of service revenue, is my guess.
Yes, definitely that create or that has a huge chunk and especially very good margins as well. So that's also a lucrative space.
Yep.
And especially there is actually a less dependency because even it can be delivered by external parties where
Well,
obviously some
those
portion will
businesses
be lost.
are scrappier and easy. They're easier to bootstrap.
Yeah.
They can be harder to fund.
Mhm.
Right. So the good news is you can self-fund them. The bad news is VCs aren't particularly interested in those types of businesses. So,
Got it, yeah.
and I kind of run one of those today as well. It's one of the businesses I run as a consulting company. So the problem is everybody wants just me, which is hard because then there's only so much of me to go around, right?
Yeah.
All right.
There is outsourcing as well, where even, for instance, even you could have actually, for instance, people white labeling. Obviously,
totally agree.
yours.
I have a team right now, but when I go in to sell it, people still want to have me involved in it, which is that's the hard part about me scaling. Right, so
yes, we need to make a lot of clones of you.
Exactly, and they all get dumber.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me give you some metrics that matter just to be thinking about, and we'll talk more about the marketing metrics after in the afternoon after lunch. So your marketing and sales motion is basically how do we create something that has predictability and forecasting as it relates to my marketing spend, my sales motion, and my business development and partnerships. So on the marketing side, I'm looking at, what's my advertising spend or my marketing spend? I think more advertising spend if I'm B2C, marketing spend if I'm B2B. And we'll talk about all those funnels and options this afternoon. How much traffic do I have at the top of the site? How many people fill out a form on a monthly basis to ask for a demo? How many demos does my sales team deliver on a monthly basis? So these are just some examples of things that can be your key metrics. But in the early days, I'm looking for traffic, right? How many people are visiting the site? How many people are filling out a form? How many people are asking for a demo? Of the demos you do, how many proposals do you create? Of the proposals you create, how many of them convert to paid? So those are some basic metrics. From a sales perspective, if you're building a product that nobody's ever built before, you have to do outbound sales. And that means I need a list and somebody needs to call customers, right? Or call prospects. And they're basically going to call and make the pitch of, hey, let me show you a demo and how this improves the quality of your life for you as the customer. So my sales metrics there are number of calls, number of demos, number of proposals, closing ratios. If my price point is low enough, I should be able to do that with a marketing perspective. If my price point is high or my product is unknown, right, I'm going to have to do outbound sales versus inbound marketing. From a business development perspective, the thing you're going to look at is what's in it for your partner. So if there's a potential partner who has a list of the customers that you want, then the question is, what's the revenue share you have to give them in order to get them to promote your product? Channel partners are weird, right? Because channel partners are good at fulfilling the demand you create. However, channel partners aren't good at creating demand. That's just not that's not their nature, right? So if you have demand, they can fulfill it for you, but they're not going to create demand because they're not going to change their sales process to add your product unless they own the product or get significant revenue from the product. So doing it out of the goodness of their heart isn't one of the things. So what you're after is more data as you go, more informed decisions, right? And then ultimately we'll get to this afternoon your go-to-market strategy, and we'll break down the marketing components, the sales components, and the business development components after lunch. Okay. Any wrap-up questions about pricing or just kind of your thinking about pricing before we go to lunch?